Hey, good morning, everybody. Peggy here at KGUA in Gualala, 88.3 FM. Happy to see you and hear you this morning. It's a little bright and sunny day. I know we've all gotten pretty cranky from the rain and ice and snow. Ice and snow. My guest this morning is Sonja Williams, and she is originally from the Bay Area, and we're going to have some great fun. Sonja is an author, an educator, a media producer, and an FOP. You know what an FOP is? It's a friend of Peggy. All right, I finally got a smile out of her this morning. She's been sitting there looking so serious. I thought, wow, how am I going to get that woman to smile? Finally got a smile out of her. And Leanne Lindsay in the background, thank you so much for helping us out this morning. Just a couple of three short announcements. Thursday, the 9th at the Sea Ranch Lodge is going to be Sunset and Jazz, Brubeck and Beyond, a musical tribute to Paul Desmond with Chris Doring on 7-string guitar, synthesizer and arrangements, Trevor Kinsel on upright bass, and of course, saxophonist Harrison Goldberg. So that sounds like a lot of fun, 6 to 9 at the Sea Ranch Lodge. And Art in the Schools is opening this Friday, opening for a new exhibit, Art in the Schools, featuring artwork produced in local schools in the Burnett Gallery and Elaine Jacob Foyer, created by Sigrid Hilscan. That is also at Gualala Arts, and that'll open March 10th, goes to April 9th, 11 to 4. And Friday, March 10th, the Whale Watch Room Gallery has an opening reception, and that's at the Point Arena Lighthouse. Opening reception featuring works by the Coast Highway Arts Collective, artists Lynn Jones, Chris Grisano, Barbara Fast. There will be hors d'oeuvres and refreshments served. And Saturday, March 11th, St. Patrick's Day potluck at the Community Center in Elk. They've been doing this for decades. I don't know, at least 100 years, I think. So if you're in the mood for corned beef and cabbage and other stuff, you can go to Elk in Greenwood. Alrighty, that's about all I'm going to share with you this morning, because I want to get moving here, and it's so rare I get to introduce you to somebody that I have known for so long. How you doing, Sonja?
Good. How you doing, Peggy?
Uh-oh, we're not hearing you.
Uh-oh.
Okay, are you there? By the way, no, you're still muted somehow.
All right, let's see.
We're also live on YouTube for those who want to look at these two beautiful women who are talking to you this morning.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, try again, Sonja.
Hello, can you hear me now?
I'm not hearing you.
Huh.
Not hearing you.
Let's see.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting to hear Sonja, let me tell you what we're going to talk about. As I said earlier, Sonja is an author, an educator, a media producer. She's a professor at Howard University and in Washington, D.C. One of the things we're going to talk about is a book that I just loved. I loved your book, Sonja.
Thank you.
Hey, there she is.
All right.
From Radio and Freedom, a part of the New Black Studies series. Okay, okay, go ahead again. I was hearing a little reverb.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Where is that coming from? Try again.
All right, I am here with you, Peggy.
Well, I'm hearing you for some reason. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, for some reason, you're kind of booming. I don't know why, but we're going to see if we can figure that out. Word Warrior, Richard Durham, Radio and Freedom. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, but Sonja, I just really loved the book.
Oh, thank you.
I just was like, oh my God, my girl can write. She can really write. It was so easy to read. And, because of the topic, which I keep saying we're going to get to in a few minutes. I just couldn't put it down. I couldn't put it down. I really, really enjoyed it. And Sonja also is a Peabody Award-winning radio producer. I don't even have a Peabody. Boy.
It's coming.
Thank you. Music lover, Howard University professor. She's been a journalist and a media trainer in the Caribbean, Africa, and throughout the United States. Wow, you've been busy.
A little bit.
So we have known each other a long time. Susan and I were trying to figure out about 3 decades or something at least.
Yeah. Well, definitely. Well, since I lived in the Bay Area, and that was in the 70s through the early 80s. So, yeah.
That is a bit ago.
A bit.
Kind of shows in our hair.
Yes.
And we also used to play racquetball together.
Yes, we did.
We kind of integrated what do you call those things? A spa, a health club or something.
Yeah, health club.
In Bethesda. Right. we just used to go there and just have a ball playing racquetball.
Yes, we did. No, I don't play racquetball. I'm actually swimming now, because swimming has always been a love of mine. And once I moved here to DC, the pools are pretty open to residents, and so I got back into swimming.
Yeah, I can actually see it. I knew you were a swimmer. All right, so you have been how long at Howard?
Oh Lord, it's amazing. When you start talking about numbers, it gets really scary. But this is my 34th year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where does the time go?
It just disappears.
That scary numbers. I realized this is my 50th year in broadcasting.
Wow.
How did that happen?
Wow, that's amazing, Peggy.
And we're still here talking to each other. Obviously, if you just joined us on Peggy's Place this morning, you can tell I'm talking with a good friend, Sonja Williams, who's an author, radio producer. She's a journalist. She teaches at Howard University, and just a wonderful person. I want to talk about your book.
Okay.
Unless you want to talk about something else first, we can.
No, we can start with the book. That's fine.
Yeah, well, the book is a few years old, but
yes, it was 2015. It came out.
Wow. And you got a lot of acclaim for the book, which is nice. The book called Word Warrior. We're trying to say those are kind of, funny. Word Warrior about a man named, I'm going to forget his first name again because I'm so nervous. Richard Durham. I have to tell you, I don't usually get nervous for an interview, but I thought, perfect for Sonja, and my brain is just like, And, so Leanne has taken care of the Zoom, so I don't have to mess that up either. But Richard Durham, Radio and Freedom, a biography of radio pioneer Richard Durham. I mean, the history, not only about Richard Durham, but the history that you bring up that we don't read anywhere of Black America. From growing up in the South, is going to Chicago, writing these incredible plays, radio plays that just weren't done. I mean, Sonja, we rarely do anything like that these days.
Right.
I mean, you and I got to do some special things, but they were like special. Here's a drop. This year we'll drop in a wonderful series, that Sonja produced or Peggy produced or Ruddy Berlingue produced, and then it's done,
Exactly. Yeah.
And so tell our audience, how did you get interested in Richard Durham?
That's a great question. And it really was because of my involvement in radio. One of the things that I did when I moved here to DC and started teaching at Howard was, we at that point, we were the Department of Radio, Television, and Film. And so there were students in radio who wanted to deal with all aspects, not just DJing, but learning how to tell stories on radio. So I was working on a project, and one of my colleagues at Howard said, there's a gentleman named Richard Durham, and they had in the mid 80s brought Oscar Brown Jr., Studs Terkel, and a couple of other people back to the studio here in DC, actually at NPR, National Public Radio, to recreate some of the scripts that Durham wrote in the 40s. So I had never heard of him. I didn't know who he was, didn't know anything about Destination Freedom, which was a series that he produced. And so that kind of piqued my curiosity. And then fast forward a few years later, I had the opportunity to work as a producer on a series that Smithsonian Radio at the time, this was in like 1992, was producing a series looking at the history of Blacks in radio from radio's earliest days to the 90s.
This is with Jackie Gales Webb, right?
That's with Jackie Gales Webb, exactly. You know Jackie, right?
I know Jackie, and I think I was actually at the Smithsonian at the same time doing another. Yeah. Jackie Gales Webb is now at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but she has. I'd love going into her office because she had Emmys. She had Emmys everywhere for her.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the only reason. Jackie's a wonderful person, but
yes.
She's the first person I ever knew that, had Emmys.
Well, yeah. And she was then a senior producer at Smithsonian Radio. So she came up with the concept of, doing a 13-part series about the history of Blacks in radio. And I was hired as one of the producers. So as we started laying out the ideas about what would each episode follow, what would we focus on, one of the early episodes looked at Blacks in radio or around radio during the 1930s and 40s. So while the presence of Blacks on the air, any people of color, were pretty limited then, there was this series in Chicago called Destination Freedom. And again, going back to my colleagues in Howard, or at Howard, they said, Destination Freedom is something you should really look into and research and try to cover in this particular episode. And when I started listening to the tapes and reading the scripts, I was like, he did this he initiated the series in 1948. And it lasted until 1950. And it was a weekly half-hour dramatic series that covered the lives and the accomplishments of Black leaders of all kinds, both historic as well as contemporary. In contemporary, we're talking about 1940, from the 1948, 49, 50 years. And so not only was he a master dramatist, but he was really committed socially to dealing with issues of freedom and equality and, anti-oppression. So it was not just drama for drama's sake. It was drama to advance the cause of freedom and justice through the lives of these men and women.
Yeah, I would love to hear some of those scripts that I read about. And the other thing about Durham that made him different, and he knew how to talk to people,
right?
Knew how to push forward in a positive way to get this series done.
Exactly.
And worked with so many amazing actors. You're talking about Oscar Brown. He worked with Studs Terkel.
Mm-hmm.
And so many other people to get these series done. I was just, they were beautiful series, and we've never heard of these, never heard of them. So when I was reading the scripts and, of course, then you want to jump off and, you want to hear them, you want to see them performed. And I was just in awe, he, some of the people, Ida B. Wells,
mm-hmm.
production on her.
And in fact, Ida B. Wells was one of his favorite characters. He said that he really appreciated and loved her fierceness in terms of exposing issues around lynching in America, and the fact that she was a writer and a journalist and a really prolific one at that.
And those words are still true today. I don't know if you saw the news, just what was it, a week ago, they were thinking about bringing back lynching in Georgia, Mississippi. I mean, oh my God.
That's sad.
It is really sad. But a couple of things. I mean, he described Ida B. Wells as a stormy woman, restless like a river, and a tongue like a flaming sword.
Exactly.
I love that. And just to let people know, one of the quotes in the book from Ida B. Wells is, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." And she thought that freedom, that quote, allowed the bigoted or the powerful to restrict the freedom of others, was no freedom at all.
Mm-hmm.
Those words ring true today.
Yes, absolutely.
Regardless of what color or gender you are.
And I wanted to say, Peggy, the thing you had said a little bit earlier, that you'd love to hear these shows. You can actually hear some of them, not the entire series, but most of the episodes are now online at archive.com. And it's a archival system that allows you to listen to, I think it's about 42 of the original episodes. And, you can go there and just luxuriate in that listening. Wow.
Thank you. Archive.com?
Yes. No, I'm sorry. .org.
.org. Archive.org.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll have to do that. I didn't know we could do that. I would have gone there today, but that's okay. It's a special thing we can get to. Now, these he produced, and they were on a CBS radio station.
No, actually, it was NBC.
NBC.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. NBC in Chicago?
In Chicago, yes.
And half an hour weekly.
Half an hour weekly, every Sunday from 10 to 10:30. He wasn't crazy about the timing of the show because, of course, that's Sunday when most people are either in church or going to church. But still, even with the time and the day, people listened to it. And the reason why it stayed on air as long as it did was because of the positive response that it generated and the awards that it won.
Absolutely. I mean, people loved it. From reading your book, people in the community loved it, and also became a power broker in Chicago politics in the background.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, the series he talked about so much. I just made a whole bunch of little notes as I was reading them. But, in 1956, he met Martin Luther King. He was questioned by the McCarthy era, whether or not he was a communist. He worked with Elijah Muhammad, I mean, he worked with so many people, did so many things, and brought it to the radio. For people.
Exactly. And, he was multifaceted because radio was his first love, but I would say that writing and the word was really it for him. And so whether that meant writing radio dramas or press releases for the Packing House Workers Union as a union worker, or writing Muhammad Ali's autobiography. He was the credited ghostwriter for that book. Or speech writing for Harold Washington when Harold, initiated his second campaign to become mayor of Chicago. So he had his hands in a little bit of everything.
Now, how did you feel when you first you discovered him, and then you started doing this amazing amount of research that you must have done? You just dove into this man and his life. What did it make you feel like as a journalist as you were reading about him?
Oh, it was invigorating, really. It was wonderful. I mean, at first I went into it because of his radio background, but the thing that convinced me that there was more here, and maybe a book might be the possibility was that as I did more research, I found out that he was a contemporary of and friends with Langston Hughes. Of course, Studs Terkel, and he and Studs were lifelong friends, as well as Oscar Brown Jr. and even Harold Washington. They became friends in the 40s when they both were, I guess, in college age. But, it's amazing just to see what I saw was this man's life was a representative of what happened in that part of the 20th century and the different struggles that Black people and other people engaged in to try to deal with the situations in America and in the world, because he was also, I don't know if he would call himself a Pan-Africanist, but he was definitely concerned with conditions of people of color around the world. So all of that was really exciting. And then it meant trying to track down the traces of his life and doing the research. And the research took me all over. It took me obviously back to Illinois and Chicago. It took me, of course, here in DC, but it also took me to New York and other places where people who interacted with him were able to talk about their relationship with him, both positive and negative, as well as, his relationship to the world and to the media in general. He also was a journalist during World War II. He was a journalist and wrote for the Chicago Defender, and that helped to set him up to be the editor for Muhammad Speaks, the paper of the Nation of Islam, which his family members, I talked to his brother and a couple of his sisters, and they were like, why would you want to work for the Nation of Islam? He was not a religious man. He didn't necessarily, believe in organized religion. But the purpose of the Nation of Islam in establishing the Muhammad Speaks newspaper was to talk about oppression or freedom struggles across the continent and the world. And that was part of his thing. He wanted to, expose and research and talk about as much as possible what was happening in the world with people of color and to advance the causes of freedom and justice as much as he could. And his weapon was the word, using words in whatever form, whether it was drama, whether it was journalism, whether it was a speech, or, whatever. So.
Absolutely. He was so prolific, and it was interesting. I didn't realize that many members of his family were still around. One of the things that I love about Sonja's website, and you can go to sonjawilliams.com, is one of the photos that flashes up is Sonja with his wife.
Right. And his wife was a real partner with him. They met in the 40s, got married, and stayed married for 40 some years until he died. But then she lived a good 30 years after he left us. And she was a fierce component, a fierce advocate for her husband, and is part of the reason why he was inducted into the National Radio Hall of Fame.
If you just joined us on Peggy's Place this morning, I'm talking with Sonja Williams, who is a professor at Howard University. She is a radio producer and obviously an educator and an author. And she's author of a book that came out a few years ago, but it's so relevant to any day and age. And it is called Road Warrior. And it's the story.
Word Warrior.
I keep saying that, that in your mind. Thank you. Word Warrior, which is harder to say, Word Warrior, but it's an important title about this journalist, writer, educator, Richard Durham, and his life. And I read the book, and I'm not kidding. I couldn't put it down. I too was inspired that there was someone who was doing that in the 40s on commercial radio.
Right.
And I don't want to get into all of our histories, but, understanding what people like you and I have gone through to do the works that we have done today.
Exactly.
Well, past couple of decades. And yet here he was on commercial radio and writing these amazing scripts, which Sonja says we can hear at archives.org or archive.
Archive.org.
Archive.org. This series was called?
The series was called Destination Freedom. And it's from 1948 through, I think it was December or August of 1950.
Wow. Wow. Right before I was born and a little after.
Okay.
So, when you spoke, you told us a little bit about meeting his wife and what a still ardent supporter of his she is. The other people that you spoke to who were either heard his work or knew about his work, what did they have to say?
They were, for instance, trying to think of, Oscar Brown Jr. met Durham when he was 18. So he really looked to Durham as a mentor. And they, again, remained lifelong friends. And he said he was the kind of guy who was knowledgeable, seemed to have his hands in a little bit of everything. But he also would call people on their stuff. If you were not doing your thing, like he said at one point, they were in rehearsal for Destination Freedom. And this show, the other thing about Destination Freedom is that it was live on the air. This was not the pre-recorded days where you could go in and fix a mistake. They rehearsed for a week leading up to the broadcast Sunday. And then it was, all speed ahead once Sunday came. And so they would rehearse and talk about the script and, if there were any changes that needed to be made. NBC obviously would have their say. The director was an NBC employee at WMAQ, but Durham was steadfast in, no, this is what I want to say, and this is what I'm going to do. There was one show, I think it was about Frederick Douglass. I can't remember specifically right now, but anyway, the edits came back from the station, from NBC. And the network, and they wanted this cut and this cut and this cut. And what Oscar Brown Jr. said was, both the actors and Durham said, "Oh no, you cannot dilute this man's story this way." And so they lobbied and they were really forceful about saying, "No, this is it." And then they were able to restore the cuts. So it just gives you a small sense of the fact that this man was in the 50s, or actually in the 40s, working to be a strong voice for his people and for, freedom issues in general, and that he was willing to fight for it. And I think that carried through the rest of his life.
I would say so. I really enjoyed seeing that side of his character, what you shared with us. And I could imagine that you probably didn't want to be on the other side of him when he was angry but the truth, to bring out the truth of America and racism and women too, women's rights. He was very much ahead of his time, I think, in that way. And, it's just so inspiring to read those and try imagine. And of course, like you having been in radio for so long, I mean, the idea that you're doing these live, these plays live with sound effects and all the other, it's just like, yeah, that's so much fun. And whatever, you can't take back something when it's live if something happens.
That's it.
Who do you know? Who were some of the women actors that he worked with? He talked more, or your book talked more about, to me, a little bit more about the men.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know
one of the local actors? Because he had almost like an ensemble that he worked with regularly through the 2-year period, and actually he would work with them before because he was part of a a small theater group that some of these actors came out of. And so this was a kind of a regular gig for them to work as a cohesive unit. So Wesley Tilden was one of the women who was a regular on Destination Freedom. In fact, I think she played Ida B. Wells in that episode. And there were others who came in and out because he was. The other thing about Durham was that I really respected, and his wife talked about this a lot too, was that he really respected women and he was a real advocate. He came from a family where his mother was, she was, at one point when I was writing the chapter on his background, his mother's voice and her presence almost took over the chapter, and I had to say, wait, this is about Durham. So let me go back to, but anyway, he really respected women. His mother was a real role model because she was all about education and, moving forward and trying to use that education to better yourself and others around you. So he really was about looking at women's struggles and trying to, get that out there. One of his co-workers, I think when he was at the Nation of Islam, said that he really was an advocate for women. And oh Lord, I forget her name, but she was one of the labor movement leaders in Chicago. And she said that Durham was right there in the forefront trying to support not only what the union was trying to provide for its workers, but also elevating women to leadership positions in the union. And he was real supportive of that. He wrote about it. He, was there in the meetings. And so that's the kind of thing. So I can't remember all of the women who were part of Destination Freedom, but I know that there were at least 2 who were part of this regular ensemble.
Right. I love that there was this whole cast of actors and friends who were who were so vital. And you mentioned the unions. Didn't the unions pay for a large part of the series at one point? I think they backed some of it, and
it wasn't the union. It was actually the Chicago Defender. Was an early supporter of Destination Freedom.
Actors had something.
Yeah, no, the union was a supporter of the civil rights movement, both in Chicago, but also in the South. And that's why he was able to meet Martin Luther King in the 50s, because the Montgomery bus boycott had just started. And Dr. King did a mini tour and came up to the North to try to raise money to support the movement. And so Durham had the opportunity to meet with Dr. King and others in this union. And this was the United Packing House Workers Union. And if you know anything about Chicago, it was a packing house hub. It was a place where, sheep and cattle and all came into the city, and then they went into the packing house or the slaughterhouses for, preparation to be sold. At any rate, he was there during this meeting when King asked the union for support, and they were able to raise substantial amounts of money to send to Montgomery.
The thing you're mentioning about the packing house, the thing that surprised me was that it was a multi-storied building in Chicago. And just because, from here and in the West, you don't think about these big concrete multi-storied buildings being full of cattle and a slaughterhouse. But yeah, there's so much history, Sonja, that you put in here. The packing house, his relationship with the future mayor, his relationship with Muhammad Ali, with writing the book The Greatest. Everybody knows Muhammad Ali is the greatest. Nobody knows Richard Durham was there writing all of this. And he started out as a boxer. I love that part about it. His life. So as we learn about his early life, and we learn about living in the South and the segregated Jim Crow era. Those are terms that we talk about these days, but not that many people understand what that really meant. You can read a book about it, but hearing the lives, and as you mentioned, his parents who were so dedicated to education.
Absolutely.
Wanted
And
their
both of them really were, they wanted the best for their children, obviously, as all parents do, but they acted on that by making sure, and actually they were part of the Great Migration. They left Mississippi. They were in Hinds County and just outside of Jackson, which is the state capital, but they lived on a farm that they actually owned, which is, not usual for Black folks in the South at that time. And that farm actually, or that land actually remained in the family for 100 years.
100 years. Wow.
Yeah. They sold it in 2005 or 6, I think it was. But yeah, they were really all about education. And one of the things, and I'll just say this real quickly, one of the stories that Durham either talked about and his wife confirmed, and his sister, one of his oldest sisters was still alive when I started this project. And she said that they had another sibling who was about 2 or 3 years old while they were still in Mississippi. And they had this open pit that the mother and grandparents would cook in near the house. And so somehow this baby fell into the fire and, got burned. So of course, the immediate thing you think is, okay, we need to immediately get this child to the hospital and try to get her treated. But because we're talking about Mississippi in 1920s, she couldn't go to the hospital. So they ran for a doctor. The doctor came to the house. And then the prescription at that time was to wrap the body or try to contain the burns in a wrap, which is probably the worst thing to do at that time. And the baby survived for a few days, but then she died. And, there's no guarantee, or there's no, we don't know if she would have survived, if she could have gone to a hospital, but the care would have been better, theoretically. And I think after that point, the family said, we have to leave. This is not the way to go. And there are 7, at that point, there were 7 other children who they, had to deal with. So they decided to move, in addition to the fact that once you reached, I think, the 7th or 8th grade, there were no high schools for Black students in that part of the South, in that part of Mississippi. So they would have had to go, and in fact, his older brother and sister went to a boarding school. And the family, his mother and father said, well, there's no way we can afford to send 7, 6, however many other children to boarding schools and survive. So they moved up north where education was free.
Wow. Well, again, if you just joined Peggy's Place, my guest today is Sonja Williams, who is a radio producer and author and a professor at Howard University. And you can tell by listening to her that she's a great storyteller herself, and has done that for radio. And as this writer of this book we're discussing, wrote, there I did again. Word Warrior. Word Warrior, about this very prolific writer and dynamic man, Richard Durham. And talking about, every time, we talk about this, and everything is still fresh in my mind from the book, how little we know about true history of families, what it was like, that story, that so poignant story about the 2-year-old in the fire and having to leave, not being able to get an education beyond 7th, 6th grade or something.
Somewhere in there, yes.
To work, right? You were meant to be out there working in the fields somewhere. And yet his family did have 83 acres. It just blew my mind. That's a big thing to take care of. And everybody took care of it. So then after the child died, they moved to Chicago, but they had friends who had lived in Chicago, and Chicago was becoming a place to go away to. What do we know about Chicago at that time?
It was slowly becoming the metropolis that we know, well, the Black metropolis, because obviously it was already a city, had been for decades. But it was developing. The neighborhood that they ended up moving to, which is now, I guess it's called Grand Boulevard, the street that they lived off of. But it was a mixed neighborhood. It was slowly transforming because as more Black people moved from the South, whether it was from Mississippi or Alabama or wherever, slowly more and more people were moving to this area. So it became known as the Black Belt of Chicago, where you had a concentration of African Americans in an area. But here's the thing. The North was looked upon as a place where the freedoms were more prevalent and you could make more money. And that was clearly true. But what was also true was that while the segregation and discrimination of the South was lessened, it still was there in the North. And so there were only prescribed areas of the city that you could move into. So his parents found this house, really sturdy place that is still existing and was in the family from the time they moved in 1927-ish through, I think, about 2020, 21. And it remained in the family all those years. So that's another major step that you don't necessarily hear about, going forward. But at any rate, in the 20s, when they moved there, by the time Durham started elementary school, through the time that he ended up in high school, it became more and more Black. And so that now that area is predominantly Black. Then that area became predominantly Black, and his education really proceeded in public schools. And he was able to really move through the system. He had some issues because he had a period where he became a thief. He was hanging out with the wrong guys, and or so they say. He could have been a leader for all we know. But yeah, anyway, he kind of was going down the wrong path, and his mother had a serious talk with him, and he kind of turned himself around. But the bottom line is that Chicago was a changing city then. And it was, as most people described it was really a city within a city in terms of Black people, that there were these areas that had their own businesses and obviously schools and all, and that's the kind of environment that he came up in.
That reminds me of this is decades later, but a book about the Los Angeles riots from the 60s. I think it was Rivers of Blood, Years of Darkness. And there was a line in there that always stuck with me that said the integration was the period between the time the first Black family moved in and the last white family moved out.
Right.
That's not so long ago.
Yeah.
I just, again, I think the history that you brought out, you use the term, the Great Migration. What does that mean? A lot of people don't know what that means. Would you explain that?
Okay, that's a good question. The Great Migration is described as the periods, because it's a long period, when Black people from the South moved either north to places like Chicago or Minneapolis or New York, or to the West Coast, to Los Angeles, to Oakland, and or to somewhere other than the Deep South. And we're talking about as many as, I think, 6 million people who at some point, whether it was from the early 1900s through about, I think they say it runs about through the 1960s or 70s, you had this influx of folk who moved to urban areas in the North or the West Coast for better opportunities.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. If there's anything more you want to say about Word Warrior, let me know, because I have some other things, since you are professor at Howard, that I want to bring up. And I was going to write this to you and I just ran out of time. So is there anything else you want people to know about Word Warrior?
Just that it's a fascinating, his story is fascinating, but it's the story of also America. And it's the way in which America changed and was changed by its people during the 20th century.
Well, that changes there's been all kinds of changes. And I think that there's been times perhaps where we are now that are a bit reactionary.
Right.
And I want to ask you, again, I didn't prep you for this, but this look at education now, whether it's in grammar school, high schools, or colleges, and the so-called controversy over critical race theory. Does that affect you at Howard? Or have you seen an effect?
Not really.
Peggy, I can't believe you asking me this. I mean,
it's because, well, as an HBCU, as a historically Black institution, I think our goal is to educate primarily African American students, but people of color who attend and who can be exposed to history and information that they may not have gotten at the high school, junior high school, or elementary school level, in all its forms, positive and negative. So I kind of laugh at the critical race theory at some point. I mean, it's serious and it's being used as a weapon against education in general. But I as a longtime educator and being educated myself, I don't even know that no, let me not say that. I knew about critical race theory, but it wasn't something that we ever talked about or dealt with in terms of education at the undergraduate level. It evolved from a law school education or curriculum. So you can't then say, oh, hey, at the elementary school level, we're going to deal with this critical race theory thing. What? No, it didn't exist and it doesn't exist, but it is being used as a weapon to say, oh, here are these folks, they're trying to educate our young people and indoctrinate them with information that is false or biased or whatever, and that's really not the case. I think at the college and university level, it is about exposing young people to ideas and concepts that they may not have known about. But it's also a time for them to explore and to expand their mind and to be able to do it in a comfortable and hopefully supportive situation, not to indoctrinate them and say, hey, this is the way you need to think. And you thought this way, and now we're going to tell you, you have to go this way. That's not the way that we approach information. And again, the whole critical race theory concept was a graduate school and it was a law school concept. It wasn't something that was taught at undergrad or even most grad schools. So there you have it.
well, I appreciate that. I didn't know about the whole law school connection. And I've been kind of mystified by the whole thing myself, kind of as you stated, this is not what all the history and the knowledge and the work that you and I have done in public radio, public broadcasting, whatever, is about educating people, but not to separate people. I think that's the big wedge that the right is trying to throw in, that this is the kind of history that will separate people, and which is, of course, mildly put, ironic to use that term.
Right. Exactly.
And, but yet we are beginning to see it in a lot of places. Explain to the audience, I'm sorry to keep doing this to you, but, what are historically Black colleges? Why do they exist?
They exist because of the way in which this country has dealt with education since its beginning. If you look at, say, Howard, Shaw University, Florida A&M University, or any of the universities that are deemed to be historically Black colleges and universities, they really grew out of the end of slavery, and they grew out of freedom schools or schools that were initiated under the Freedmen's Bureau when slavery was ending or as it ended. And that it enabled people who had not had access to education when they were enslaved to get educated. So Howard dates back to 1867. Trying to think of others. There are others that date back to right at the end of the Civil War, 1865, 1866, and on.
Wow.
So these are institutions that really started off maybe as, one-room schoolhouses and as normal schools where they were about educating, getting young people and even adults. We're talking about enslaved people here. So they could not read or they could not write or they had limited abilities to do either of those activities. But these schools were then started by either missionary societies, churches, the Freedmen's Bureau, or else or private organizations. And then they grew into the institutions that we know today. And they had a clear purpose to educate African-American people, young, old, or whatever, to be able to then be full citizens in this society. And they have grown since then. There in the past have been more, and some have unfortunately gone by the wayside because of funding or whatever else. But there are now about 100, a little bit over 100 HBCUs across, well, I won't say across the country. You don't find any necessarily on the West Coast.
Right.
I don't even think there's any in California. There may be quasi ones where you have a larger Black or Latino, and there are even some Hispanic serving institutions, which are more recent. But in terms of HBCUs, they largely are in the South or the Northeast.
Well, to follow up on that, why did you decide to go to Howard and become a professor there?
It was accidental.
Okay. Okay.
It was not part of my overall plan. When I left California, and I loved living in the Bay Area, and that's where obviously Peggy, you and I met and hung out. But when I left the Bay Area, I left to go to grad school, and I went to grad school back in the Midwest in Ohio. When I finished, my goal in going to grad school was I wanted to own and operate radio stations.
I know one is going to be for sale soon.
Okay. So that was my original goal. And so I went into, I studied broadcast management. When I finished, I either wanted to go back to New York, or maybe even Chicago, but I wanted to go to a major city. And of course, when I went to the big city, I was too green. I had never owned anything. So it was like, okay, kid, leave, get some experience and do something else. So the opportunity to actually manage and create a station came about after I finished grad school, and I was offered a position in a small college, again, another HBCU in Florida. And so I went there, and not only was I teaching, because obviously I was really hired primarily to do that, but they wanted to develop a radio station and some, deal with newspapers and all that. So that was my first foray into creating and managing radio from a college perspective. And so that was there. And then I moved to North Carolina. I continued there. They hadn't established that was an FM station, Carry Current, in Florida. But when I got the opportunity to move to North Carolina and Winston-Salem State, they had an FM station that I was able to manage and then obviously train students to work in all aspects of radio there. So part of the thing that happened while I was in grad school was in being in Ohio, my colleagues and I would come up to DC as often as we could to get out of Ohio because we were in a small town. We used to say nowhere, Ohio. But at any rate,
apologies, Ohioans.
Right, very much, because really going to school at Ohio University was great. But at any rate, we came up to DC, and I just fell in love with the city. And also, at the time, Howard had and continues to have a radio station called WHUR, which was a major force in radio, commercial radio here in the city. And it had I think it had already developed, in fact, it had developed this format, which is now across the country called The Quiet Storm. So I was like, wow, I would love to work at WHUR, not necessarily on the music side, although that was another love of mine, but in news. And so that's basically how I got to Howard. I applied there, that didn't work. And then I ended up applying to the School of Communications, and there you have it.
There you are. I love it, but you did it the right way. I just, our organization just ended up buying a station, buying a frequency, starting a station, and suddenly from a radio producer, independent producer, here we are, Susan and I own a station, and wow, what do we do with it? And I asked Ugo, and he says, Peggy, you can do whatever you want. It's like, wow, I can do whatever I want. And so that's how KGUA came about. It's been 13 years or so now.
13, that's great. Peggy,
yeah,
that's
well, it is. It's a struggle because we're in a tiny community, and right, staying alive is hard, and having volunteers. But the power of media is so important, as both you and I know. And I miss those days of being an independent producer. And in many ways, there's still so many other stories I want to get out back on the road and tell. But we have the ability serving a specific community. And right now, weather is the big issue. And so people come to us for safety. And, that it makes us very proud that they've come to trust us and to, seek information and look to us for safety, but also fun. We have a wide variety of programs because I'm interested in everything. Excellent. And then doing Peggy's Place every day. I don't know how many interviews I've done, literally maybe, 25,000 or something over the years, maybe more. I think over the years, 50 years, probably closer to 40,000 interviews. Something. When I say it, it can't be right. And then I start adding them up. But anyway, I just really, really appreciate what you shared with us today. And, and the book, again, I can't praise it enough.
Thank you.
Word Warrior, it's and it's only listed as like an academic book. You don't see it in the because of the publishers, and yet
you do see it. It is on Amazon, and it's in Barnes and Noble, so you can get it from those booksellers.
Yeah, folks, I tell you, it's a wonderful book, not only to learn about the history of radio, but a whole lot of history about Africa.
One other thing I will say is that the printed book is available online and through those sellers, but there's also an audiobook version of the book that I produced with a woman named Robin Miles, who is the narrator, and she is excellent. She's a professional actress, and she just brought the book to life on an audiobook.
I think I've heard her name before, but wow, Sonja, I didn't know you. When do you find out to do all this?
Yeah, Robin Miles was the narrator for The Warmth of Other Suns, as well as Hidden Figures, along with about 400 other books.
Sonja, we got to say goodbye. I'm sorry, my clock is ticking down, and I got to move to this repeats at 1:00, and it'll also be on our SoundCloud as well, KGUA.org, and just hit the SoundCloud button. It's just such a pleasure to see you.
Great to sit
with you, and we'll have to do it again before our hair changes more or disappears. Sonja Williams has been my guest today on Peggy's Place, an educator at Howard University and an author. And okay, Leanne, we're going to let you take it away. I see you over there in the background. So take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.